Mr. President, more and more Americans from all walks of life, of both political parties, feel that there's not just a pond or a sea, but an ocean of difference between the real world where they live in Washington, D.C. They view, I think correctly, Washington, D.C. as a different planet where normal rules don't seem to apply. That's why on the first day I could introduce new legislation in this new Congress, I chose to introduce a package of reform measures, measures aimed at bridging that gap, bringing those two worlds together, returning Washington to the real world and reconnecting with the American people. Now, the American people are also concerned, rightly, of the bitter partisanship, the overly ideological tone of almost all of the debate we have here in Washington now, here in Congress. And I believe these sorts of reform measures, the 4 bills I've introduced in particular, can also help bridge that divide, because they're not ideological, they're not partisan, they're good government reform, things that can and should and hopefully will bring us together and reconnect us with the American people. Again, it's another reason I chose to introduce this package of 4 reform measures, 4 good government bills on the first day I could introduce legislation this Congress. The first is a very simple and basic but fundamental idea, term limits for members of Congress. And I'm honored to be joined by 6 other senators right off the gate, right out of the box in terms of co-sponsoring this important legislation. Senators Paul and Ayotte, Coburn, Lee, Rubio, Cruz, and Johnson. I thank them for their co-sponsorship and their support. This measure would limit members of Congress in the House to 3 consecutive terms, total of 6 years, in the Senate to 2 consecutive terms, total of 12 years. It's the consensus measure supported by citizens groups very active and supportive of the concept of term limits. And the idea, again, is simple: to reconnect Congress with the American people, to do away with the notion of legislating as a career, and to get back to the founders' vision of citizen legislators. When I was in the state legislature, I authored and passed term limits for the state legislature. That required a state constitutional amendment, a big deal, a 2/3 vote in each body and then a vote of the people. But because of the people's voice rising up and being heard, we achieved that. And with that reform, which was voted overwhelmingly into the state constitution by the people of Louisiana, we have a regular influx now of new, fresh blood, real experience from the real world that reconnects in a very healthy way the state legislature and all of us, the citizens who it's supposed to represent. That was needed for the state legislature. And if it was, and it was, it's needed 1,000 times more for Congress, because that divide, that sea, that ocean, that difference between different planets in the eyes of so many Americans is even greater between Congress and the real world, Congress and the American people. The second bill I've introduced is a bill to do away with automatic pay increases for members of Congress. That is present law, that we get regular increases of pay with no proposal, no bill put in the hopper, no debate, no need for an inconvenient vote. I think that's just outright wrong, and I think it helps build that distrust on the part of the American people. And I'm joined by a bipartisan co-sponsor, Senator McCaskill of Missouri. I thank her for her leadership and her support of this measure. Again, the measure is very simple. Just repeal, do away with any automatic pay increases for members of Congress. If there's to be a pay increase, there should be a bill proposing it, an open debate, and a public vote. The third measure is also fully bipartisan. I'm introducing it with Senator Bill Nelson of Florida, and that's reform of the Corps of Engineers, something very important for our two states, but for indeed the whole country. In Louisiana, in Florida, and elsewhere, unfortunately, the Corps of Engineers has become a poster child for a dysfunctional federal government, a federal bureaucracy, a federal system that's just bogged down, doesn't work, takes 10 and 20 years to study something, never ever getting to construction. We need to streamline and reform that process, and the Vitter-Nelson bill does just that by greatly streamlining the process by which Corps projects can come to fruition, putting state and local leaders more in charge of that effort, at first on a pilot basis. Hopefully we'll expand that in the future for important Corps of Engineers projects. Again, that's particularly important for our states of Louisiana and Florida, but it's important for so many states and for the country as a whole. And fourth and finally, I'm introducing a measure that I've had before to reform federal campaign finance law to prohibit PACs and campaign funds from employing members, spouses, or family members. That's just a way, quite frankly, in some circumstances, for members of Congress, politicians to pad their family income. And I think that's wrong, and that leads directly to the real suspicion and low regard so many Americans hold this institution in. So again, this bill is simple, straightforward, but important. It would prohibit spouses and immediate family members of Congress from receiving payments from that member's campaign accounts or leadership PACs. That is a loophole, an area of abuse that we must close, that we must prohibit that abuse in the future. These four bills won't solve every problem out there. They won't be the be-all and end-all of important reform and good government efforts, but they would be an important start. They would help us truly reconnect with the American people, narrow this divide, which is so vast right now, between the real world, real Americans, and this institution. And they would be important nonpartisan, non-ideological reform efforts that we can gather around Republicans and Democrats alike to do something positive, to do something productive, and to reconnect with the American people. So I urge my colleagues of both parties to support these measures, to come on as co-sponsors. Many of you already have, and I thank you again for that. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.